Welcome back, Addictions Today. This is the third of the three-lecture middle of the course. The topics of anxiety, health, and addiction were chosen to comprise this unit because I tend to think of them in terms of pathological learning. Some of us are more wired up to have this pathological learning, but the loops of anxiety, the challenge of somaticizing and coping, and the self-destructive or self-undoing behaviors of addiction, these are all ways of being that are learned from and shaped by the environment. In this way, I think the topics are immediately comprehensible to anyone with the ability to reflect on their experience. Yes, if I am anticipating being anxious, that can make me anxious, fulfilling my prophecy and teaching me to be more anxious. Yes, how I react to a stressor, how I appraise it and expect to be able to handle it, will in part determine its effect on me. And yes, some substances, things, and behaviors are so habit-forming that my free will and best intentions frequently fail, as if I'm driven by the habit rather than the part of me that knows better. These are all relatable challenges that we can at least imagine failing at some of the time. It is more difficult to imagine having a disordered personality, intellectual disability, or being haunted by psychotic breaks from reality. But, as extreme as some abnormal ways of being are, we are all human, and the traits on which some of us are so abnormal are traits we all have some score on and some variation on. And I don't want us to forget this as we learn about categories and extremes, as we gain labels and concepts, as we hear descriptions that the messy 3 pounds of meat in our head will conflate with reasons, explanations, or causes. You do not experience mild anxiety because you are mild anxietied, nor does anyone experience extreme anxiety because they are extreme anxietied. The what exists, you are experiencing mild anxiety, so you are mild anxiety. Someone with extreme anxiety is extreme anxiety, but a what is not the why. In fact, very rarely is it a satisfying what that we come up with. Coming up with a what is only the beginning of defeasible knowledge, of being able to make useful predictions and adjustments that could improve the world. Hopefully, the relatability of the challenges covered in this middle section will lead you to expect to be able to relate to the other types of abnormality. And hopefully this expectation helps you accomplish that, helping you hopefully to find an inside-out type of understanding to go with the labels and criteria offered. Recall that the requirement for diagnosis or determination of a disorder is not just being abnormal or experiencing the world abnormally, but failing in some way to adapt to the challenges that come with this way of being. We are nearly all addicted to certain behaviors, devices, apps, media. The criteria for addiction were presented in Lecture 3.
In order to get diagnosed with a substance disorder, you need a maladaptive pattern of substance use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by 2 or more of the following occurring within a 12-month period. So you only need 2 occurring within the last year. First, recurrent substance use resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. For example, repeated absences, expulsion, or child neglect. 2. Recurrent substance use in situations in which it is physically hazardous. Do you drive drunk, for example? 3. Do you have a strong desire or cravings to use the substance? Now, 3 is circled here because this criterion used to be different in the DSM-4. In the DSM-4, we had, did you ever get in trouble with the law regarding your substance use? Now, as we know, some groups are a little more targeted by law enforcement than others. So the DSM wanted to remove that criterion, and it just so happened that we have a ton of new great research on craving and the neuroadaptations and sensitizations in the prefrontal cortex that happens when you get addicted to something. So we replaced trouble with the law with strong desire or cravings for the DSM-5. Criterion 4, continued substance use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused or exacerbated by the effects of the substance. For example, do you fight with your spouse over having used the substance? Do you have chemical tolerance defined by either the need for increased amounts of the substance to achieve the same effect, or a diminished effect when you continue to use in the same amount. Your body's getting used to it. It's upregulating the response that tries to keep you in homeostasis, i.e., you're getting better at fighting the exogenous substance that you're sticking into your system, and you therefore need more of it if you want to make yourself as high as it was making you before. Withdrawal, as manifested by either the characteristic withdrawal syndrome of the substance, which is going to be different for every substance, or taking more of the substance in order to avoid this characteristic withdrawal syndrome. So what's happened with withdrawal is your body has downregulated its own ability to independently create the natural version of the substance that you're sticking into yourself from the outside. 7. The substance is often taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than was intended. 8. There's a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control substance use. This criterion is one of the reasons why roughly 90% of the people who smoke cigarettes are addicted to cigarettes. Most of them have tried to quit and failed. 9. A great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain the substance, use the substance, or recover from its effects. Here you can see how an illegal substance might be more likely to have you tick off this box. It's pretty easy to get cigarettes, it's pretty easy to get alcohol, maybe a little more difficult to get an illegal substance, so you may be more likely, if your substance happens to be illegal, to be able to check off item 9. 2 more. 10. Important social, occupational, or recreational activities are given up or reduced because of substance use. And 11. The substance use is continued despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem that is likely to have been caused or exacerbated by the substance. So an ulcer made worse by alcohol consumption, or maybe you have anxiety or psychotic symptoms that are made worse by the substance that you're taking.
If you find yourself using more than intended and have tried to cut back or quit but have failed, you qualify for a disorder. The reward spike of dopamine you get from starting yet another video, buying yet another thing, eating yet another Oreo, or looking yet again at your notifications is the same reward spike that starts the runaway process of addiction to those and other things. First, let's model addiction from the cells out. This will keep us away from social constructionist distractions because, yes, addiction is an idea made meaningful by how we intend to use it, but it is more importantly for any given person a thing for which the idea may be of use. Let's look at the thing as directly as possible. Then we will use that model as we walk through psychological and social aspects of addiction. Your definition of addiction: a chronically relapsing disorder characterized by compulsion to seek and take the drug, loss of control and limiting intake, and emergence of a negative emotional state when access to the drug is prevented. And here is why what was described by the definition is a problem. This tends to be referred to as the paradox of addiction. We act against our values and goals. Our heart, intentions, vows, promises, and shame say one thing, but our behavior says another. How can a person develop and maintain a pattern of behavior that is so obviously destructive and counter to his or her own life? First, across substances, we have a common progression. Drug-taking behavior progresses from an impulsive stage, where the primary motivation is the substance's positive reinforcing effects, to a compulsive stage, where the primary motivation is the negative reinforcement obtained by the relief from drug withdrawal. What's being illustrated by the arrows above the circle diagrams is the fact that when we return to using after a period of abstinence, use and the impact of use tends to be greater after each abstinence, in part because when you return to use, what you're returning to is a nervous system that remembers and knows how rewarding things are. It already has some of the pathological learning, so rather than starting back at square one, you start your relapse in an impulsive stage where the pleasurable effects are already learned, and you tend to cycle quicker through that impulsive stage into the compulsive stage. Individuals with addictions report that many factors contribute to their relapse, including exposure to drug-related stimuli, things associated with drugs, stress, boredom, lack of other reinforcers, or just a desire to get high again. There's a concept from postmodern philosophy from Jean Baudrillard. It's called the hyper-real. Going out for coffee with your friends may have been fun and stimulating and rewarding, But the internet or hyperreal side of it is more so. Rather than just drink the coffee, you took pictures. They were posed to look more intense or joyful than the average moment at the actual get-together. So your representation is already hyper-real, but that gets put into a world, the social media world, whose rewards and reactions in terms of likes and views and comments, and even just your imagining other people looking at that hyper-real picture that you took and posted, can be re-experienced and even reinterpreted as better with each like and comment and share and imagined view that you subsequently see or think about. This hyper-real simulated version of the get-together leaves a whole bunch of questions, including what, if anything, is left of the real encounter after the hyper-real gets through with it, and does the real or what is real matter anymore, which is just the type of fun that postmodernism tends to have in general. But what we're left with is the fact that people are now growing up in a world where the real parts of it are the least important parts of it. Sure, you needed to go to coffee to get the picture, but in terms of your limbic system and your dopamine rewards, that snapshot and the ability to post it open up a far more rewarding and engrossing hyper-reality. So, if you want to match, in reality, the feelings you get in hyper-reality, you essentially need to cheat. Hyper-reality so effectively elicits responses endogenously from your own reward or punishment neurotransmitters and hormones, that if you want a response anywhere near that, when you are out and about, you would need to introduce an exogenous substance. Alcohol, weed, microdosing hallucinogens, random white pills. It's either that or hang out with your phones out, because the real world is neurochemically boring to you. If this is the condition you find yourself in, then you are vulnerable to stimulus substitutions, because in the real world you will be under-challenged. But the more likely concern is that, stuck in the compulsive stage, you will spend more and more time online, just to avoid the itch of withdrawal that comes from not being online. It's not that you don't like reality, it's that you can't stand being away from the rewards of hyper-reality.
Over time, someone with an addiction will experience many episodes of withdrawal, agitation, and discomfort at the absence of what they're addicted to. The withdrawal response can become classically conditioned to the stimuli associated with the environments in which the withdrawal occurs. Let's say the time between your breaks at work was longer than you would like, so at work you experienced nicotine withdrawal. In this case, your work and the people in it become associated with withdrawal. Now, let's say that you get pregnant, get time off from work, and have undergone detox, so you've been abstinent from cigarettes for a year, and then you go back to work. When you return, withdrawal symptoms, such as craving, can be triggered by exposure to the conditioned stimuli. In other words, your work environment can induce withdrawal and the type of craving that comes with it, even after a year of sobriety. And this is sticking only to the biological level or dimension of analysis. Most of us could narrate pretty easily a litany of psychological and social factors that would make us return to smoking in this circumstance as well. Mere habit, work stress, the expectations of our peers. Returning to the example of socializing with your phones out, let's say you experience a month or two where you're addicted to something on your phone. A game, a social media app, or some good back and forth conversations that you were nearly constantly plugged into for that stretch of time. During that time, you may have had a class or a job or some other obligation that you had to satisfy where you also were unable to access your phone. Through the model displayed, it could be the case that even though you are now detoxed from that quote-unquote addiction, the withdrawal you experienced when you were addicted but attending to that obligation installed a conditioned withdrawal response to that obligation. So even though you don't care for that game, that app, that conversation, the class, job, or obligation could still make you crave your phone. There are obvious applications here to relapse planning and prevention. Hopefully, it's now clear how someone who has undergone a full detox can still revert to prior cravings and even withdrawal symptoms as a function of simple biological level association. Next, there are 3 types of tolerance, recalling that tolerance refers to needing more in order to obtain the same result. Metabolic tolerance, also called drug disposition tolerance, is when repeated use of a drug reduces the amount of the drug available at the target tissue. What? Well, some drugs, like barbiturates, alcohol, and morphine, increase their own rate of metabolism by inducing liver microsomal enzymes. You likely know someone who is relatively good at holding their liquor. This could be in part because their body has adapted to produce more of the liver enzymes that metabolize liquor, a process called induction. Induction of liver enzymes, specifically the cytochrome P450 family, will reduce the effects of alcohol because the increased available enzymes break the alcohol down to non-intoxicating acetaldehyde faster. And since it's the buildup of unprocessed alcohol that makes us drunk, this metabolic tolerance makes us less likely to get or stay drunk. Too long didn't listen, more drink, more enzyme breakdown, less intoxication. But most of the substances, and presumably all of the behaviors that we care about, do not exhibit metabolic tolerance, so let's look at the other two types of tolerance. Pharmacodynamic tolerance refers to changes in nerve cell function to compensate for continued presence of the drug. So your nerves are changing, your neurons are changing. Examples include both receptor downregulation and upregulation, but either way, the adaptive mechanism is producing effects opposite to the initial drug effects. Your body is trying to stay alive, so when you introduce exogenous substances, it responds in part by counteracting those substances, something that used to be called opponent process. This opposing process, the body working to oppose the substance, gets stronger with more substance use and more exposure, and pharmacodynamic tolerance can translate to withdrawal. The drug is no longer present, but the adaptive mechanism that opposes the drug remains functioning. This is an explanation for why withdrawal symptoms are sometimes the opposite of the intoxication symptoms. If the drug calmed you down, the opponent process would work to alarm you, so the withdrawal symptom is agitation. This is usually what's meant by the term physical dependence, the physiological state in which the body adapts to the chronic presence of a drug and elicits a drug-specific withdrawal syndrome if the drug is abruptly stopped. But what we're talking about here is tolerance. So the main point here for pharmacodynamic tolerance is that since the body, specifically the neurons, get better at counteracting the effects of the substance, it takes more of that substance to get the same effect. Your neurons are learning to counteract the substance. This brings us to behavioral tolerance, also called context-specific tolerance. This refers to the phenomenon of tolerance occasionally being absent or reduced in a novel environment. Somehow, my body learned to counteract the substance in place A, maybe my basement, but fails to muster this counteracting response in place B, maybe someone else's apartment. In other words, pharmacodynamic tolerance can be dependent upon the environment or place of administration or learning, and to explain the name behavioral tolerance, the behaviors engaged in prior to or during the drug administration can determine this tolerance as well. Just like withdrawal, as we found out in the previous slide, just like withdrawal can be classically conditioned to a situation, pharmacodynamic tolerance can be classically conditioned to a specific set of behaviors performed in specific places. The dramatic and potentially lethal case of behavioral tolerance is where a substance user is used to taking a certain amount to get high and takes that same amount somewhere else and experiences overdose, in part as a result of their body's normal tolerance response not being brought online. This is not the common overdose story. The common overdose stories are people taking a substance or a potency level that they didn't expect, or people who took a break from using, they had time away from the drug, and so they lost some of their tolerance, but they took their usual pre-break dose when they came back, for which their partially detoxed body wasn't ready, or people who mixed substances, which led to unpredictable results. For many people, use of both alcohol and illicit drugs naturally declines once they reach adulthood, maturing out of a drug-using lifestyle. Most of the respondents here being referred to are discussing their use of marijuana, by far the most used illicit substance. So in Canada, our present and future research will, when it uses the term illicit, be referring to different substances on the whole. But as with most other illegal things that people do, as you age, you tend to get less likely to do them. just to give us a visual demonstration of the fact that no two stories of addiction are the same. Here are the stories of 10 individuals with opioid use disorder. Note that their stories are very different. Case 71 can be read as a brief period of occasional use of opioids, followed by a couple years of daily use, a year and a half of institutionalization, and then sustained abstinence. This would likely be a case of maturing out. Case 126 has a long 4 or 5 year stretch of abstinence, a return to daily use, brief institutionalization, abstinence, daily use, abstinence, daily use, abstinence, daily use, institutionalization, daily use, institutionalization, daily use, institutionalization, abstinence, daily use, and finally methadone maintenance. In case 162, aside from a period where their status is unknown, switches from daily use to institutionalizations for the entire 20 years. These individuals all have the same diagnosis, opioid use disorder, but they have very different stories. Despite this variety of experience, the process of addiction is well modeled by a single spiral. If you take some time, you can note that all 11 criteria for use disorders are captured in this diagram. There's also nothing in this diagram which precludes our applying it to behaviors or objects to which we might be addicted as well. As individuals progress repeatedly through the cycle, drug reward often declines as tolerance develops. Other factors become important, such as incentive salience, a key component of the incentive sensitization theory of addiction. Incentive sensitization theory says that there's a difference between drug liking, euphoria, and drug wanting, craving. As a drug addiction develops, the user experiences an increase in wanting the drug, even though there is no change or often a decrease in drug liking. This disparity is thought to occur because different brain mechanisms are responsible for these two components of drug use motivation. Berridge and Kringelbach in 2008 argue that the liking system is focused on restricted hedonic hotspots, but the wanting system is more widespread in its action and includes things like your mesolimbic dopamine pathway. During the withdrawal and negative affect stage, drug reward decreases, one of the many neuroadaptations in response to repeated exposure to a drug, and this results in long-term changes in the brain that lead to motivational transition, i.e., we go from being motivated by our liking the substance to being motivated by our simply wanting the substance. Koob and Lamole proposed two types of neuroadaptations involved in the transition, this transition to addiction. Within system adaptations in the reward circuit, resulting in progressive downregulation of activity, so less activation, less reward in your normal natural reward circuit, and between system adaptations, specifically gradual recruitment of the anti-reward system. This anti-reward system is upregulated, made more active. The anti-reward system increases release of norepinephrine and the neuropeptides, corticotropin releasing factor, and dynorphin. The system has two major functions: put a limit or brake on reward, and mediate some of the aversive effects of stress. Your body essentially says, look, based on the intensity of what you're doing to me, I'm going to fight it. Whatever normal was for us, I'm going to work to restore it, because that homeostasis is what got us this far. I've been keeping you alive with whatever homeostasis we've had, and I'm going to try to return to it. This anti-reward system is the updating, or the more precise specification, of the classical opponent process model of motivation that we were discussing earlier. The neural mechanism responsible for affect, mood, and emotion provoke an initial strong reaction, whether this is pleasure or discomfort, in response to the substance, and automatically set in motion this opposing anti-reward response that occurs after that initial stimulus ends. The body also makes more general structural adjustments, specifically your hedonic set point changes. Here we have our response when we first encounter the substance. Above the line is pleasure, and below is discomfort. The total motivational valence, in this case, should bring to mind the reward craving from the impulsive stage of substance use. After continuous exposure, we start to feel negative affect in the absence of the substance. Our normal state is now the negative feeling, unless we have the substance. The total motivational valence here should bring to mind the relief craving from the compulsive stage of substance use. What you might notice is the steepness of the decline in the affect as the substance wears off. This third graph illustrates taking more of the substance, binging, in order to prevent this withdrawal. The affective set point is moved even lower, intensifying relief craving and making the affective drop after use even more severe. The anti-reward system is pushing back against the substance, making the slope steeper, the trough lower. The anti-reward system is getting stronger, and the endogenous normal reward system has relinquished its responsibilities to the exogenous substances, of which we have been giving it too much. So, during the withdrawal negative affect state, drug reward decreases, one of the many neuroadaptations in response to repeated exposure to a drug. With regard to the preoccupation and anticipation stage, dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex and its associated circuitry is hypothesized to play a key role in the progression of this stage of the addiction cycle. This stage is specifically characterized by intrusive thinking, drug craving, and lack of impulse control. Researchers have identified the neural circuitry underlying these processes. Intrusive thinking has been linked to abnormal activity in pathways from the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala to the ventral striatum. Cue-induced craving correlates with activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the dorsal and ventral striata, and insula. The insula has been recently implicated in motivational regulation, including drug craving and control over drug use. Before moving on to psychosocial dimensions, a restatement of our definition of addiction: a chronically relapsing disorder characterized by compulsion to seek and take the drug, loss of control in limiting intake, and emergence of a negative emotional state when access to the drug is prevented. Now, we explore addiction with a bit less concern for precision. 4 substances, aside from caffeine, to which Canadians are the most addicted: alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, and opioids, in that order. So, zooming out, there are 3 threes of addiction. There are 3 C's, 3 S's, and 3 Aries. The 3 C's are compulsion, under which we could put the words urge and obsession; control, under which we have the paradox and the contradiction, where you seem to be not in control like the habit or the substance is controlling you; and consequences, which in addiction, the main problem or puzzle is the fact that we will continue to use despite dysfunction, loss, or conflict caused by our use of the substance. The 3 S's you may be familiar with: set, setting, and substance. Set specifically refers to the mindset you have when you're using, the thoughts going through your head. The difference, for example, between a good trip and a bad trip with hallucinogens can hinge upon something as simple as the emotion you were feeling just before the drug started to kick in. Setting refers to where you are, the feel, the surroundings, the associations, and the substance just refers to what you're taking in this place, in this mindset. The 3 Aries refer to the intervention stages or intervention levels that we may target: primary, secondary, and tertiary. We have primary prevention of addiction, which could include gymnasium lectures, where individuals go to middle schools or high schools. Maybe they are survivors of addictions, and they tell their stories and wag their finger and say, "Don't do drugs." These have mixed effects. In some cases, these interventions have the exact opposite of the intended effect, i.e. they lead young people to experiment, but in some cases they are effective. The key is not in convincing any given student to change their attitudes. The key is in making the student think that you might have changed their peers' attitudes. If I convince absolutely no one in the gymnasium that hallucinogens are deadly and satanic, but I manage to make quite a few of them think that I have convinced their peers, then that could be enough to get some of them to behave according to the attitude I was attempting to instill, even though they don't hold that belief or attitude. And through acting in accordance with that attitude, because they think that's what their peers hold, they'll start to see themselves as having that attitude, and then they will. But this typically wouldn't work just as a one-off. You would need periodic reinforcement of the message. Another example of primary prevention would be drug interdiction at the border, preventing substances from becoming available at all. Secondary intervention is where most psychotherapy would be, motivational interviewing or behavioral therapy. Here, the individual has been exposed to the substance and perhaps is diagnosable with addiction, and the concern is helping them through it, with the focus being ending the addiction, stopping the substance use. Tertiary intervention is about helping individuals with substance use challenges, but doing so not by addressing the substance use, but by secondary damage caused by the substance use. Needle exchange programs and safe injection sites are probably the best example of this. The justification for these programs has primarily been to stop the spread of HIV and other things that could be spread by sharing needles. With safe injection, or supervised injection, or safe consumption site, the idea is also to have someone nearby in case the substance you take is tainted or you overdose. There's somebody there to help you. So we're still looking at addiction from a distance. Addictive disorders used to be considered disorders of personality. Now, granted, so did a whole bunch of other things. It took us a while to figure out what personality disorders were. But that observation was made in part because there's so much overlap with addiction and disorders of personality. If someone has an addictive disorder or a substance use disorder, they are also at noticeable increased risk for a depressive or a personality disorder. And if you look at the description in the DSM-1 from 1952, there's not a lot here to help you specify or make the diagnosis of an addiction. This is all you get. Currently, we break substance use disorders down by substance. These are the major substance categories. Note that caffeine does not have a use disorder per se, but it does have a withdrawal syndrome that is now recognized in the DSM-5, with the suggestion that in the future caffeine be considered a substance use disorder category. There is also now one recognized behavioral addiction, which is gambling. In the Disorders for Further Study appendix, they have specified internet gaming disorder, but as the title implies, they're not quite sure what they're referring to with internet gaming disorder, so we'll see what that becomes in the next iteration of the DSM. Some connections or risk factors relating addiction to personality include behavioral disinhibition. So substance use is linked to a cluster of traits: impulsivity, antisociality, unconventionality, and aggressiveness, combined with low levels of constraint and harm avoidance. These components of behavioral disinhibition tend to be related to risk for development of addiction. Other factors that influence the development and maintenance of drug abuse and addiction include habits of stress reduction, so high scores on traits like stress reactivity, anxiety, and neuroticism tend to indicate heightened vulnerability to stress, and this pathway fits with the self-medication hypothesis. Individuals saying that they take substances or initially took substances in order to manage stress or anxiety. Finally, reward sensitivity. Drug abuse is related to traits like sensation-seeking, reward-seeking, extroversion, and gregariousness. Individuals scoring high in these traits would seek out drugs for their positive reinforcing qualities, or be more likely to, or be more rewarded for doing so. Looking at the social level, familial factors have been studied most with regard to alcoholism, alcohol use disorder. An estimated 90% of cases of child abuse and maltreatment involve the use of alcohol, and being mistreated in childhood is a risk factor for later alcohol use disorder. Presence of violence within the family and being subjected to less parental monitoring has been implicated as a risk factor for developing addictions. And there's a large body of research on what are called adult children of alcoholics. These are people who are now adults, but when they were children, one or more of their parents had alcohol use disorder. These individuals are at increased risk for various challenges, including developing alcohol use disorder themselves, trouble with relationships and emotional well-being, having learned their relationship dynamics from a parent or parents with alcohol use disorder. Claudia Black gives us what could be called our fourth three of addiction, the three don'ts. These are three rules that families that have at least one individual with alcohol use disorder in them tend to implicitly adapt or follow in order to maintain peace or normalcy around the individual with substance use disorder. The first is don't talk, the idea being that talking could just cause more problems, more emotional dysfunction. If the parent is using alcohol in order to manage stress, stress, and talking causes them stress, then trying to help through talking could lead to more problems. Next, don't trust. Your mother promised she would come to your soccer game or pick you up from daycare, but she was too drunk or forgot, and so you learn not to trust, not to get your hopes up, because trusting and promises bring disappointment. The third rule, implicitly picked up and followed by families that have one or more individuals in them with alcohol use disorder, is don't feel, largely because if you feel, then someone might notice your feeling. So feeling is then a type of talking. This is just to give you a flavor for how some of the social level dysfunctions are characterized with regards to substance use disorder and its later consequences. So let's zoom in a bit to the psychological context, and we'll use alcohol as an example. What do we encounter when individuals have alcohol use disorder? We encounter defense mechanisms, the most superordinate of which is denial. Defense mechanisms are consequences of the addictive disorder, and these predict relapse and they predict unwillingness to cease behavior. Denial is the most widely used defense mechanism by both the individual with alcohol use disorder and the family surrounding them. The individual might say, well, if I drank like Sean, then I would really have a problem. Sean drinks more than I do. He lost his job. I don't drink like Sean drinks, therefore I don't have a problem. Sean is a logical red herring. Whether you have a problem or not is not dependent on Sean. Also, and related to the self-medication idea, is rationalization. A rationalizing individual might say, well, I drink because of the stress of my job. If I had another boss or if I had another job, I wouldn't have to drink, but I do because I have this stress. This individual is not wrong. This rationalization is adequately protecting their ego. It's just not protecting their liver. Another would be minimization. I never miss work. No matter how much I use the substance, I've never missed work. The goal of this would be to say whatever other problems one is experiencing as a result of the substance use, it couldn't possibly be that bad because they've never missed a single day of work. And here in red is an especially tricky one that I like to call specialization. This might be someone who is not in denial regarding the consequences or their severity, but they are in denial about their particular specific risk. These individuals might say, yes, smoking causes lung cancer, and it's difficult to quit smoking, but I can. I am enlightened. Whenever I decide to quit smoking, I will. I am special. This is especially a problem doing secondary interventions with young individuals because in adolescence, people tend to think that they individually are uniquely immune to what they admit those around them are subject to, and it makes it difficult to get them to take seriously or to apply to themselves facts or risks that they recognize as true or extant. Here are the Alcoholics Anonymous 12 steps. These steps have helped many times more people than any specific psychological intervention. And some psychological therapy is just to facilitate individuals going through the 12-step program. For those who might have trouble with the religious language, see Russell Brand's translation. Addiction impacts many areas of our lives. So, when we are interviewing clients, we'll take what's called a social history. We inquire about various areas, in part to find where the key consequences of their addiction are occurring or are likely to occur. We might be very specific and ask them if they have liver problems or headaches or ulcers, irritability, depression, suicidal thoughts, loss of sex drive, high-risk behavior, arguments with significant others, social isolation, fear of losing job, acquired debt, getting behind on their bills, and any drug-related truancies or arrests. Notice that some of these are butting up against the social context. The values of an individual come from their immediate and larger societies. Some of us recall in 2014, when in the Winter Olympics, Team Canada was playing the US for gold, we had a problem because the games started in the morning. But we had a rule, a law, that said you can't serve alcohol until 11 o'clock. Do we respect the rule, which presumably exists for a reason, or do we change it because our national pastime can't be enjoyed without alcohol? We changed the rules so that you could drink alcohol at 8 a.m., or rather be sold alcohol in bars at 8 a.m. The message here from the top down is that alcohol is as culturally important as hockey. And just in case that point needed underscoring, our Prime Minister bet on the game a case of beer. A substance that is less celebrated on the social level is tobacco. This study was conducted with Australian undergraduates. The study asked people to rate how disgusted they are with a given group of individuals and how much they believe that being a member of that group is under the individual's control. And they graphed the results to show, firstly, a general relation between how in control of their group membership we think people are and the disgust we associate with that group, with the stigma against smokers being quite severe. Note that the scales went to 9, so people are not generally saying they are very disgusted with smokers, just relatively so, and they're tending to associate quite a bit of self-determination with being in the smoker category. This is just to illustrate what you already knew, which is there's quite a stigma against smokers. I can remember when inside every restaurant there was a smoking and a non-smoking section, and now you're not allowed to smoke unless you're 9 meters away from that building. And this stigma is in part based on established facts, like the fact that smoking is harmful to health, which roughly 95% of us believe in Canada and the US. With regards to secondhand smoke, which in Canada kills roughly 800 individuals per year through things like cancer, heart disease, SIDS, and low birth weight, the acceptance that secondhand smoke causes this harm is at about 85% in the US and Canada. That said, it is still legal as a psychoactive substance, while so many other substances are not. So we have society valuing alcohol, denigrating tobacco, and with cannabis there's been a shift. This shift has coincided with, though is not necessarily related to, an increase in potency. In the 60s, the estimated THC concentration by mass of the type of marijuana you'd get on the street was about 1, maybe 2%. That didn't change much into the 80s and 90s, but in the 2000s we start to see the average concentration in street samples are quite different from those in the 60s. By the 2010s, we have an order of magnitude increase in potency from the 60s, and after legalization in Colorado, the average concentration of street samples in a study there was 30%. A similar study in Canada by Marketplace found an average concentration of 20%, but they noted some strains that were consistently 30% as well, contributing to that average. So what cannabis is has changed quite a bit. If you take numbers from the European Union from 2008 to 2015, you have potency roughly doubling. Concentration in the Czech Republic moving from 5% to 26%, concentration in Estonia from 5 to 9, Sweden from 9 to 19, France from 10 to 22, and the concern for abnormal psychology is that with an increase in potency, you have an increase in the substance's ability to exacerbate psychiatric issues, whether these are anxiety, psychosis, or depression. So the vulnerable amongst us are, with the increased potency, more likely to see negative effects from smoking cannabis. But it's not just an increase in potency that's part of the social landscape, there's also a change in public opinion. If you go back to the 70s, the average person is saying that people should be arrested if they have marijuana. And this doesn't change too much into the 90s. But again, in the 2000s, we see bigger changes. We hit peak approval of cannabis in 2016. And while this may seem normal, we're actually quite unusual on the world stage. Unusual enough that the World Health Organization, which we might typically associate with saving people from Ebola and malaria, raised an alarm that our 15-year-olds are abnormally okay with marijuana and are abnormally, by global standards, likely to have tried it. Now, I have nothing generally against being the world leader in favor of substances. Maybe we're onto something. But from the top down, the guidance has not always been great. Here's BC Health Minister Terry Lake. We certainly know it is efficacious for a number of illnesses like epilepsy in children, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, there's a few claims here. Let's use this report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, entitled The Health Effects of Cannabis and Cannabinoids, the Current State of Evidence and Recommendations for Research. To just do some simple Control F searching across its 486 pages to see whether Terry Lake's comments are supported. Control F for epilepsy. There is no or insufficient evidence to support or refute the conclusion that cannabis or cannabinoids are an effective treatment for epilepsy. In other words, maybe he's right, but there's no evidence sufficient to believe that he's right. Certainly nothing solid or well established enough to be touted by a health minister. Next, Control F for Parkinson's. There is no or insufficient evidence to support or refute the conclusion that cannabis or cannabinoids are an effective treatment for motor system symptoms associated with Parkinson's disease. Okay, multiple sclerosis. There is conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis or cannabinoids are effective for improving patient-reported multiple sclerosis spasticity symptoms. Okay, this is a win. I'll count it as a win for Terry Lake. If you look at the rest of the document, when it comes to physician-reported symptoms, we don't see this effect, but we'll still count it as a win. Moving on to PTSD, and keeping in mind that we give our soldiers with PTSD medical marijuana. There is moderate evidence of a statistical association between problem cannabis use and increased severity of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. In other words, we may be harming our veterans. So let's just edit Terry Lake's comment a little bit. There we go. Now can you get back on stage and specify that, oh, you work for the medical marijuana industry now? Never mind. On the other side of things, our institutions do recognize at least the acute effects of marijuana, namely poor memory, impaired learning, and attentional difficulties in the hours, days, and even weeks after use. These are acute effects, and after a few weeks, your performance improves. Toronto Police Services, for example, has institutionalized 4 weeks, 28 days, as the time that it takes to sober up from cannabis use. So if an officer has been found to have used cannabis, she or he is expected to absent themselves from work for 28 days so as not to be working under the acute effects of the substance. That said, a reasonable case can be made that there are longer-term effects as well. The general observation is that with initial heavy use, we see decreases in gray matter volume, but increases in white matter connectivity. So some cell body death, but some connectivity increase. Yet with longer-term heavy use, we see a decrease in this connectivity as well. And the explanation is pretty simple. Heavy use kills brain cells. The killed brain cells lead to compensation for those lost cells through more connectivity. But if you have enough lost cells, your capacity for connectivity goes down as well, so eventually you start losing white matter as well, because your ability to compensate is limited. There's more content in the notes on the negative effects of cannabis, which I share just because I feel like it gets ignored. In my opinion, we made the right decision with legalization, but not with education. We should let people know what they're actually getting into, especially young people for whom the effects are more dramatic and far less reversible. That's enough for now. Stay tuned.